On Wednesdays, I anticipate it. On Thursdays, it's a great pleasure to speak with someone who, as I've mentioned, is the darling of British media, American media, when it comes to breaking down complex and important legal issues. He is without peer. Please welcome the great David Katz.
Hi, great to be with you.
Yeah, former federal prosecutor, now working as a defense attorney in Southern California. And I look at this, at what's happening in. Can we start with Alabama, with this Alabama Supreme Court ruling? Maybe you can speak to that, and then we'll work back to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court of Alabama has, in a state that outlaws abortion, now gone after in vitro fertilization, David Katz.
Well, this case probably will not go to the U.S. Supreme Court for the same reason that people think it's a little odd that the Colorado Supreme Court case banning Trump from the ballot was taken so readily by the U.S. Supreme Court. Normally, if there are independent state grounds, the U.S. Supreme Court backs away. We're a nation of 50 states. So it doesn't look like this case will actually go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's really a weird procedural background, but three people who had these embryos at a clinic found out that the embryos had been destroyed. There'd been negligence, they claimed, at the clinic. And so the embryos were destroyed. They sued and they tried to get punitive damages under an Alabama state law, which you get punitive damages if somebody messes around with a human being. So they argued for the punitive damages that these embryos were human beings. This is the fetal personhood on the march in Alabama. And their argument actually won in the Alabama Supreme Court. It had lost in the trial court. So now they're allowed to go back to the trial court and sue, including for punitive damages on the basis of the fact that their embryos were persons. They were as the advocates against choice and against all of those issues. This is the Dobbs crowd, the ones that pushed for this change in the law for all of these years, Mark. These are the ones who call them preborn children. There's no scientific background for this, but it's an independent state law that apparently the Alabama legislature said that these embryos were children. So that's kind of where it is right now. And of course, there's a couple of really scary consequences, even though you can say that it's a limited ruling, which is going to affect this case when it goes back to the trial courts in the state of Alabama, because these clinics now are not keeping the same procedures that they did before. And they're scared to death, these hospitals, that their doctors and nurses will be prosecuted, not only sued, but prosecuted. It will greatly increase the insurance premiums that these hospitals, doctors, health professionals have to obtain if they're going to be involved with in vitro fertilization. And so it's a real chilling effect on all of this. It affects an awful lot of people who want to have kids. Normally the right to lifers pick on the poor. They pick on the desperate women who need, an abortion, or they need the medication abortion. And so who are their victims besides society? The pro-lifers, their victims are these poor women, often teenage, often minority. But these are, I think, some people who can actually fight back and who can lobby against this legislation, Mark, in these red states, in these very anti-choice states, because these are middle-class people as well as poor people, but there's a lot of upper middle-class people who want to have kids. This is their hope. Now, of course, they may spend their money flying to states that don't have these, in my opinion, scientifically baseless laws, these theological laws now in some of these states. Of course, they'll fly to states that still have it, but hopefully they'll also contribute and get involved in the political process to be on the other side of attempts to get this legislation. They'll go to their state legislators, Mark, and they'll say, we're a gay couple that want to have kids, and this is our hope. And it really matters to us. And they'll contribute to candidates, and they'll be part of the public discourse. And of course, a lot of upper middle class people who want to have kids, because what's happened right now is that, as I said, the University of Alabama has now suspended its in vitro fertilization programs. Other clinics are now following suit. And so while it's a limited ruling in some ways, and I say it's not going to be reviewed, I believe, by the U.S. Supreme Court or the federal courts, because they're going to say, where's the federal question? This is a state question. But you can see the impact. And of course, the pro-lifers are just gleeful that this is another one of their rewards reaped from the fall of Roe v. Wade. This is another Dobbs awful outcome.
Yeah, it's been an incremental kind of creep associated with this. It's funny, last night I was speaking to someone who they have 2 kids as a result of IVF, and he was saying, yeah, we had 3 embryos that, after, we had successful IVF, the embryos are destroyed. It's not, they're not human life, that entire process that I just described, that is to say, the then disposal of those that were not used in the IVF, that would be considered murder under Alabama law. Isn't that right now?
That's exactly where this is going. And as I say, the anti-Roe v. Wade crowd, it's not really a crowd to me. It's actually a very small minority of the population, but for them, it's such a looming, huge issue. And for a lot of people who are on the other side, who are pro-choice, who want to see women's rights, respected, including the right of a woman who's not fertile to have a baby. This is definitely going to burden it and diminish it. And there would have been this argument maybe under Roe v. Wade, but now with Dobbs, it's supposedly thrown back to the states. And if you throw it back to the states, you get what I consider really weird results like that. The only thing is that there may be some relief, Mark, in the political process, because these are people who can fight back, unlike sure, people fight back on the Roe v. Wade issue. People are going to the polls in droves. This is helping the Democrats. They think they have a shot at winning Republican seats on Long Island over this issue.
Right.
Forget the migrants coming into New York City. Forget the crime issue that gets ballyhooed all the time. Suburban voters are going to the polls and thinking, oh, my God, this could happen to, a young woman that we know or woman that we know. So it's become a very politically dynamic issue. But in places like Alabama, I don't think it really is. But I do think, Mark, that you're going to see people. This is my political judgment, not legal. But I think that you're going to see a lot of people who have political power who can participate in the process. There's loads and loads of Republican women who are 35, and this is their chance to have a child. And they take a look at this and they say, oh, my God, not only are the lunatics running the asylum, but this really affects me and affects people like me. So let's hope that there'll be a political backlash to this of the choice crowd, the IVF needing crowd. And of course, it's a huge issue for a lot of gay couples, right, who want to have kids. And so, I that's sort of all of my legal and political opinions on it. Let's get to the U.S. Supreme Court.
No, well, just did you have something, Kim, before I move on?
Kim, sorry.
I had a legal question about state constitutions, because when I was reading about this case, I was reading about the law in the Alabama state constitution that the state Supreme Court used to declare an embryo a child. And just a couple sentences of this, they cannot wrongfully destroy an embryo without incurring the wrath of a holy God, or each life has incalculable value that cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God. Also, section 36.06 of the Alabama State Constitution says, even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory.
Yeah.
So the question is,
it's scripture.
what about the separation of church and state? Is it legal to have such religion in your state constitution? Don't we have a law saying that we can't do that?
Well, it's very complicated. All of these First Amendment, there's the First Amendment that the state cannot establish a religion. And there's also the idea that they have to be separate. What's the famous line? Render unto Caesar what is of Caesar, and render unto God what is of God. And that's even the biblical injunction to keep separate church and state. And it meant a lot to the framers of the Constitution, and they put it right there in the First Amendment. But the fact that something has sort of a theocratic basis may not invalidate it as a law. Something can be lawful and also be something that sounds very theocratic to us. So Alabama, by statute, says an embryo is a person. An embryo is a preborn child and is entitled to this or that legal protection. And so, there's the law. And I don't think it's going to be struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court on the basis that it violates, the separation of powers, or it somehow establishes a religion in Alabama. So then the problem is, if you're a doctor or nurse, and now you have done something negligent toward this person, and there's also punitive damages for it, do you want to pay 10 times the insurance premium that you were paying before that statute? And you could say, well, that really burdens their right to exercise their profession, and they may say that, and there may be litigation over it. But I think that you're sort of, and my kind of, just common sense take on it, that, wow, that sounds like something that they would do in, I don't know, in Iran or in Saudi Arabia or something. I mean, it's so theocratic, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to be a reason to knock down that statute. The statute just survived, and unless it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court or the some federal court, there it is. It's the law of the land. It was also a huge majority of that Supreme Court. I don't know if it's 8-0 or 8-1 or 9-0, but it wasn't like it was a 5-4 of the Alabama Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I like that you spoke to the ripple effects economically, because I think that is something that really hits the street even in Alabama. But I just to be clear, on Kim's question, which I thought was really a good one, and her point and query about the separation of church and state, just to be, David, you can write, if you're a justice, whatever the hell you want in there. You can mention the Lord, you can mention anything you want. Isn't that right? You're not bound by, in any way rhetorically, in terms of what words you can use when it comes to, if you want to invoke the Lord in your, which was done here in this judgment.
Well, you got to look at each separate case. But let's say that a state legislature said that the Lord treats black people worse than white people, and so do we. Whoops, that would be evidence of a racial bias. And
But I'm just speaking to the Lord part of it, not the racial bias part of it. If I said the Lord created this pristine natural environment that shall remain pristine from all toxins, so you, British Petroleum, will not be able to dump here or whatever, it's almost a superfluous, gratuitous thing that I mentioned the Lord in that instance, right?
I think that's how most legislatures would look at it. But if you tied it in with something that was more actionable, like I said, some racially discriminatory animus, that you could say right there, that was by the lower court, or that was by the legislature in a state, that might become important in, let's say, a civil rights case. It might be important in a First Amendment case, but I just don't think that this case, because of its independent state ground, I just don't see the U.S. Supreme Court taking it. I think that I think they're going to try to go for certiorari cert in the U.S. Supreme Court, but I don't think that the losers in the state Supreme Court of Alabama are going to get the U.S. Supreme Court to even take their case. So that'll be the law in Alabama until someone changes the statute, until the Alabama legislature. I was in Alabama on a case in Montgomery, Alabama. And so it's a really weird feeling, because growing up, the generation that I did, the main thing that we knew about Alabama and Montgomery, Alabama, was then Governor George Wallace standing on those incredible courthouse steps that go up a hill in Montgomery and saying, segregation now, segregation forever. And of course, that's not the law anymore, thank God, in this country. Did I just say thank God? In this country. But, there I was in federal court representing a client, and it's right across the street from that, from that courthouse. It's being in Montgomery, Alabama. That's also where the famous bus ride was. And that bus that
sure.
Parks, well, I forget
the
her first
Rosa
name
Parks.
now.
You're talking the Rosa Parks is what you're talking
The
about.
Rosa Parks school bus is also there, but there are those steps. And when you hear that the Alabama Supreme Court did something, it put my head back in Montgomery, Alabama. And like so many places, lots of nice people. A lot of those states, 40% of Alabama probably has the same opinions as a lot of people who listen to your show. The problem is that 40% never seems to win these days. Even in Texas, it's like 46-54, but the 54% always seems to win down there in Texas.
Well, when it comes to congressional districts, so that's just all gerrymandering. You could, some of these, in some of these districts, you can get 70% of the vote, and you still are going to lose because of the gerrymandering.
Mark, I want to point this out, if you don't mind, real quick. especially because I have, a lot of relatives in Wisconsin. My wife is from Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is just having a huge change where, it's a purple state, and yet it's dominated in both houses of the legislature by the Republicans. And they just issued an anti-gerrymandering decision. There are new maps. And suddenly all of these districts, state districts, but soon it'll be congressional districts, will be, where both sides have a fair shot, because it's going to be really the end of a stark gerrymandering that lasted about a dozen years. And that was really profound in a state that's purple, where 70% of the houses, it was some unbelievable amount, 65 or 70%, Mark, were Republican.
I'm glad you pointed it out. I mean, it's a blight, yet one more blight on the people's voice, in my view, and I think in everyone's view on some level. But thank you for pointing it out. I want to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. This good neighbor provision of the Clean Air Act is what's being litigated, I think, and you can, I think, frame it most effectively, so I'll get out of your way, but it just seems to me as though the agenda of this Supreme Court, besides Roe, which gets all the, the ink, is to undermine a lot of the basic regulations that are on industry and corporate polluters. And this is a great example of it.
Well, this is an alarming case that the U.S. Supreme Court took it, and that they took it at this stage. People who lived in Los Angeles at the time, or have heard about it, we were a place like Beijing. We had terrible air. When you hear how cool the 60s were and everybody was inside at these clubs, one reason was because the air was so bad outside. We had huge smog, and we have ameliorated that. We've greatly improved on that because of the Clean Air Act and things that the federal government has done. We had Lake Erie went on fire. There were so many pollutants in it before we had the Environmental Protection Agency. And who created it but President Nixon? There was actually a consensus that something had to be done about the terrible shape that the environment was in, not going forward like global warming, right? But right then, the air that you breathed right then was so full of smog. It was so terrible, still is for people with asthma and all of that. So this is not one where you can argue back and forth, and is there a major case doctrine and all that. The Clean Air Act is very clear. The EPA's authority in this area is very clear. And so this is even more of an encroachment by the U.S. Supreme Court. If I can get down into the weeds just a little bit, because it's interesting, each state under the Clean Air Act, under these federal laws that are very clear, has to come up with a clean air plan. They have to do something to keep down the amount of pollutants coming out of smokestacks, coming out of burning coal all over the place. And you can see that if you could burn coal in one state and then this terrible air goes into the next state, it's a huge downwind problem for lots and lots of states. A lot of them turn out to be blue states. A lot of them are in the Northeast, where a huge amount of air pollution coming out of, let's say, West Virginia or coming out of Ohio blows with the prevailing winds west to east and blows over Pennsylvania, New York, New England, and so forth. So this is a national problem. The EPA wanted to get its arms around this national problem, so every state had to come up with a way to abate air pollution, Mark, right? And a lot of states came through. They tended to be blue states. They tended to be more environmentally conscious states. And so you ended up with about 23 states, most of them red states, that had problems. And so what the EPA is supposed to do is litigate, but also come up with a federal plan. So as to these 23 states that were not getting their act together, that were litigating over whether their plans were sufficient or weren't sufficient, they were abating air pollution or they weren't, the federal government shouldn't have imposed a plan on us, that was all getting litigated. Meanwhile, the EPA and the federal government said to each of them, you've got to come up with this huge plan. You've got to spend, let's say, $50 million a year to not be upwind polluter of all these downwind states. All the states need protection. The upwind states, you're polluting your own state, but you're also polluting the hell out of this downwind state. So you got to get with the program and do all of this. These kinds of cases, Mark, end up getting brought in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. You don't go to the trial court. You've had all kinds of trial-like proceedings at the EPA. They have administrative proceedings. And so once you're done, if you don't like it, if you're a huge polluter, let's say, you go to the DC Circuit. Just what happened here. Ohio and these other states went there and they said, by the way, it costs us $50 million a year to get into compliance with these programs. And so stop making us spend this money. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, you have to keep spending that money to get into compliance. You lost the request for a stay. If you lose your request for a stay, you can go to the US Supreme Court and you get this shadow docket. And we've talked about it for a while. And they say, okay, we're going to keep the stay in effect, or excuse me, we're going to not have a stay, just like the DC Circuit said, or we'll overturn it. It looked very clear, like 6 of them were willing to overturn it. They were just going to issue an order throwing out the stay. And I guess going back and forth, they said, you know what, let's have a hearing. But what's shocking is that it's a request for a stay that the DC Circuit didn't grant, and yet it's being argued in the US Supreme Court. So of course, the 3 moderates to liberals were saying, what is this? We're supposed to be the court of last resort. How did we become the court of first resort? No trial court ruled on this. The DC Circuit hasn't even ruled on it. All they said was you're not entitled to a stay. Keep spending the $50 million. So if I can just take one more minute on it. So what happened was that while all of this was going on, remember there's 23 states, right? 12 of the states actually won their litigation and they got stays. They got stays where they didn't have to spend the money. So some of those states don't have to keep spending the money. But Ohio, Indiana have to keep spending the $50 million. They said to the US Supreme Court, great, now that you have a hearing on it, we have to spend $50 million a year. And they said, well, that's what happens. If there's a statute or a rule that's in effect and you don't like it, and if you don't get a stay from any court, you have to keep spending the money. You have to obey the law, just like everyone else, unless you get some ruling that makes you stop having to obey the law. So that's where it stands right now. But if you're betting money on it, you want the Katz-Adamas prediction, it looks like the 6 of them are going to say no. Ohio and these other states don't have to keep spending the money. They can stop spending the money to get into compliance. Supposedly, this is some huge irreparable harm, and they're treating these huge polluters. The huge polluters are in the case too, as well as the red states like Ohio and Indiana that say we don't want these huge polluters in our state to have to spend all of this money. So it's the polluters and it's the states that are left saying, hey, the EPA screwed up because it never considered that half the states would get stays and it would only involve half the states. This was supposed to abate 25% of the pollution in the country, air pollution, and it's only abating 12%. And of course, the answer to that is better to abate 12%. And the EPA thought about that fact. They thought about the fact that if that happened, they still wanted it. They still wanted to do it. As I say, Mark, this is not one where you have to say, well, Congress didn't give this power. This is in some gray area. No, this is in a very clear, clean air area where they have all the power in the world. And it looks like this really is an encroachment on federal regulatory power that is proper, because 6 justices of the 9 on the U.S. Supreme Court seem to be favoring the polluters right down to giving them a hearing, right? Before
a hearing that skips the lower courts. It's insane. I mean, that's why I think it's so great that we're talking about it today. And we've talked about it on this show a lot. Anybody who's a regular visitor to the show knows I consider this a front and center issue. As I've said, this Supreme Court is part of an effort to dismantle the EPA and certainly neuter them. They struck down the Clean Power plan. They slashed their jurisdiction over the Clean Water Act, as you know. And the minute you slash jurisdiction and you take away the EPA's power to regulate these toxins, and you turn it over, they say, well, we turn it over to those legislative bodies in these states or Congress. I mean, you've turned it over to people who have no science background, no background in environmental science, environmental toxins, if they'll do anything at all. And there's that fishing case that we discussed not that long ago. I mean, it's not really about fishing. But they talk about it. It was regulations involving the fishing industry and overfishing. Anyway, David, I'm so honestly downcast about this Supreme Court. I think this is their real agenda. They are insanely corporate polluter friendly, and they've reached into the system to make this happen.
Well, this is why people say that the efforts, and they've been joined now by Adam Schiff, who's running for the Senate. I guess he's on the ballot in just a week or two. A moderate to liberal, a very sensible person who I don't think used to support the idea of expanding the number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. But now that he's seen this thing develop, after it's not just a 5-4 majority, but on these issues, it's a 6-3 majority. He's come around to the view, which I've had longer than Adam Schiff has had it, that we really do need to expand the number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court to have 4 more. That would, I think, first of all, they certainly fit. There's no problem with it. You look at how small this country was when we have 9. You only need legislation for it. All these people who think they want a constitutional amendment, they want this, they want that, they're not going to happen. If you want to do something practical and doable, have 4 new members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that would, I think, people say, well, as soon as the Republicans got a lot of power back again, they would go from 13 to 15. They'd go from 13 to 17. You know what? If that happens, it happens. But I always say this, especially to the younger people in your audience. Do you want to live for decades under this U.S. Supreme Court, which on these kinds of issues is 6-3? And forget about, as I say, down the road that we need to do something about global warming. Right now, this is about huge amounts of pollution. Poor people suffer the most. People with asthma, with all kinds of health conditions, suffer the most. This blows into your state. You can be the greenest state. You can be, everything that you want to do to cut your own pollution. And then here's the state right next to you, some red state, which has hugely powerful polluters in the political process in that state. And here, the upwind states, as they're called, and you're downwind of them and all of their terrible smokestack pollution. And here it comes into your state, and you voted for a federal government that's doing something about it. And here you have a blocking by 6 of the 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court. At the end of the day, and this the Solicitor General argued to the Supreme Court, Mark, yesterday. He said, "What is their argument on the merits? This is a perfectly proper regulation. It's been promulgated properly." And I think Gorsuch or somebody like that said, "Well, they never really considered what would happen if half the states got stays." Well, Mark, there was a comment period, and people said, what happens? And the EPA said, well, then it's severable. They said, you know what? We would rather block 11% or 12% of the pollution. If we can't block 20% of the pollution, we would still do it. And they say, well, no, the EPA didn't really think about it, didn't think about how expensive that would be, that it wasn't really efficient if they were. Yes, they did. So all it is that I believe these 6 justices don't agree politically with the aims. And the other thing I want to say, Mark, is this: if you can slow this down long enough, sometimes it goes from Democrats to Republicans. And unfortunately, it's not like Nixon and Ford anymore. Since then, it's been a sharp divide from what I can see, where the Green Party is the Democrats and the polluting party is the Republicans. How it happened that way, but that's just what it seems to be when you look at who the presidents are. And if you keep flipping Democrats and Republicans, and while the Democrats are pursuing these rules, they're stayed and they don't have to be observed by the polluting corporations. And then, it changes a little bit. And then you have somebody come in like Trump. I think Nikki Haley would not be good on an issue like this either.
Oh, Nikki Haley wouldn't be good on a ton of different issues.
Exactly. This is the traditional Republican Party as it's become right now. So if every time the Democrats are in there and they're trying to do something to help with the environment, they get stopped and stayed by the Supreme Court, and then it kind of never gets rolling again, because now there are new executive regulations. There's a new head of the EPA, and they don't pursue it. We need to do something not just about our future, pollution and the global warming of the planet, but we need to do something right now. Some people are very lucky not to be in a downwind state and not to have this blow over them. And it's kind of a boring subject, but it's sure not boring for the millions of people who suffer the bad health conditions and all the other health problems.
I think the dismantling of the EPA is not a boring subject at all. I think
at all.
I've told you, I think it's a front and center issue. And I think you mentioned Justice Gorsuch. His mother, Ann Gorsuch, ran the EPA, and it was her agenda item to dismantle the EPA when she was running it. And I couldn't agree more. The Democrats are so stinking worried about being labeled activist, and we have activist judges, and look what they're doing with their activist judges. You can't show me a Supreme Court more activist than this. This is insane. David has just explained how they've reached into the process to help make this possible for toxic polluters. So I support you wholeheartedly on the expansion of the court, and I wish the Democrats had the balls to do it. I have no time, but I want you, with limited time, David Katz, please, to comment on this FBI, quote, informant on Joe Biden, who it turns out had a bunch of fabricated information that Republicans made the centerpiece of their impeachment and their proceedings against Joe Biden and his family, et cetera. Can you speak to the charges now that are being leveled against this, again, FBI informant?
Actually, I know Smirnov's attorney. He's a good attorney. He actually got him bail in Las Vegas. And I think that's going up on appeal. They're going to try to get him remanded. For the people who are worried that he has such a good lawyer in Las Vegas that he's going to not only get bail, but split. You can imagine he's being surveilled all the time. He's on an electronic monitor. This guy's not going to split because he's out on bail right now, but he is out on bail right now. And he seems like just sort of, one of these hustlers, one of these guys who kind of, the collapsing Soviet Union, he kind of positioned himself in a way that, he's getting there. He's a paid informant. So we criminal defense attorneys are always suspicious of these paid informants. They're going to sing for their supper and they're going to sing right. They're going to sing wrong. They're going to try to say what their handler wants to hear. And I guess he felt the vibe that it was somehow going to help him. He'd get a lot of money if he knew something about the Bidens and Burisma. And it turns out he knew nothing. He was probably getting fed Russian intelligence, disinformation, because they never liked the Democrats these days, and they seem to want to get Trump in there. So it seems like this guy was just completely incredible. And of course, the Republicans in Congress, the MAGA crowd there, they really wanted to believe. And so they fought like hell to get this raw intelligence from out of the FBI. They threatened to hold the FBI director himself in contempt. And finally, they said, look, this is too much of a headache. Just give this raw intelligence over. And and they also indicted him now for basically lying to the FBI. This is the kind of charges, remember General Flynn. General Flynn told a lie to the FBI. And they prosecuted.
Well, if he gets the General Flynn deal, he'll be in good shape, right, David Katz?
Well,
what do you?
So well said.
Yeah.
By the way, his case is coming to Los Angeles. I think he was arrested in Las Vegas, but I think the indictment was filed here in Los Angeles by the special prosecutor. This is Weiss, the same special prosecutor who's prosecuting Hunter Biden. If I can make one comment about Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden should have taken that deal in Delaware. You and I talked about that. I thought that was a huge error not to take the deal in Delaware. He was going to get diversion. He was going to get a misdemeanor. I think that he and his attorneys there, who I don't know, not the same attorney as the one I know in Las Vegas, but the attorneys there, I think they just pushed too hard. They wanted sort of a guarantee that Hunter Biden wasn't going to be prosecuted later on. Let's say Trump got back into power. And they just tried to bite off more than I think that they needed to there. I think Biden should have just taken that deal. Remember the famous hearing before the Republican judge there in Delaware? But she seemed like a very good judge, and she wanted to get to the bottom of the plea agreement. Now, they're arguing right now that they had a firm agreement with the government, that the government was going to give them diversion or a misdemeanor or something. I don't believe that the record shows that they had that power. Those deals in federal court have to be approved by the judge. And that's what the judge was about that day, seeing whether she would approve it or not. And when she heard that they weren't really in agreement, she didn't approve it. So I don't think that I think that Hunter Biden already is ruining the day that he didn't take the deal in Delaware. Sometimes you have to say, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I used to be an assistant U.S. attorney. If people both walk away and say, I didn't quite get all that I wanted, those are the deals that stick. If you push too hard, sometimes
not such a bad
they
deal.
fall apart.
Sure.
They fall, and this one fell apart. And this one fell apart for Hunter.
Troubled guy, wealthy, connected guy, and he's just someone who's made, and with, as you say, pretty good attorneys, but bad advice. And he's made a lot of bad decisions in his life. David Katz, thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to laying out some legal complexities and issues and having you decode them. Congratulations on being a worldwide force in media.
Well, we sure talked about some interesting ones today, and I agree with you. There's nothing boring about these environmental cases. This is the world that we live in, and the world that our kids and so forth, the next generations have to live in. And so I think it's so great that you emphasize this environmental one, and I think this one's really clear. This is even clearer than the other ones. That this is the hand on the scale of justice. That these 6 justices are putting this one is so obvious. And I think it's going to come out that they're going to make Ohio and these other states not have to keep paying anymore. And as the three justices said, Ohio, you've got to pay $50 million. Whether there are 23 states in it or 11 states in it, you're one of the 11 in it.
Yeah,
you didn't have to
right.
pay 50 more because the other 12 states aren't in it. You didn't have to pay 50 more. You had to pay 50 before. You have to pay 50 after. Pay your $50 million a year to get into compliance. And if you win or you get a stay, you can stop paying. But this is not our law in America. You have to keep obeying the law, just like everyone else, until the law changes or some judge says you don't have to obey it
now
anymore.
The courts are gamed up, so we will see. David, thank you. Love talking to you. Talk to you next week. David Katz, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.